everyone. Welcome to the third instalment of our Places for Aging Presents series this year. As you know, we've been sort of working our way through a series of topics around co-living and its application in aged care. We've dealt with, I think, some urban design issues and some issues around ownership, which is by Malcolm, which was great. And we have delved into some detailed planning with Kirsty Volz in our last session. So to sort of flesh that out, we've invited Jason Hilder to come along, and I'll let him introduce himself in due course, to talk about some of the social aspects of living with other people. So if you're going to create these kind of communities, how do you make them work on a social level? So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jason. Please welcome him.
Thanks, Ryan, and good to meet or see each of you showing an interest in this tonight. It's great to be able to share this knowledge with you. Start by sharing screen. We had a run through previously, so I believe everything works well. Okay. So tonight I'm going to be sharing with you, as Ryan mentioned, living with co-living, and with a secondary intention of applying the social characteristics of intentional communities to places for ageing. My name's Jason, as Ryan had mentioned. I'm with the University of Queensland, coming up to the very, very, very last stages of PhD, which I'm glad, and my supervisors would be very glad also. This is a number of photographs from community or groups around the world, or co-housing around the world. A small snapshot of the many that are available, and the many great initiatives that are happening. But before doing that, I would like to honour and acknowledge the traditional custodians from the place where I'm sending this message from, and also the custodians from the lands where you are also receiving this information. To elders past, present and forthcoming, we honour and acknowledge your traditional and your continuing custodianship of the land. So I felt when I was putting together this presentation, Malcolm introduced me to the group. I felt it'd be important to share a little about myself, so to give you some background. So I have had a varied career, and at one moment in my life, just before the birth of my daughter, I was contemplating what was life going to be in the future and how did I want to see the world. And in my searching then, I happened to be recommended to go to Findhorn Foundation Scotland, which is an eco-village, and attended a couple of week-long courses there that I will say radically changed my way of looking at the world and life. And since then, I've been studying and delving into intentional community living in whatever ways I could get knowledge and share knowledge. And most recently, I stepped into a PhD candidature at the University of Queensland with the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences. And my PhD is focused upon intentional community living arrangements in Australia and also some European countries. I'll explain the definition of what community living arrangements are a little bit later on. I also, for a 6-month period, had a placement with Malcolm Holtz in Economic Development Queensland, State Government Department, and there we worked on a potential way to introduce co-housing to their assets. I have a lived experience of urban communities and eco-villages, learning the positives and the challenges, and I currently live in Crystal Waters Eco-Village in Sunshine Coast.
Right, yeah, okay, that's good.
Question, why did I do this? I mentioned a little bit before. I believe that the deeper I went into the research, the more that I found solutions to the challenges that we're currently having in a housing landscape. And to me, intentional communities, we can learn a lot from. I'm with my colleagues, we published an article about communal living in Australia in the Australian Planner about 2 years ago now. And at last look, it's 530 reads with 5 citations, which I kind of think that's pretty good, but I'm not sure. And I'm also an active member of Genoa Australia, which is the Global Eco-Village Network Oceania and Australia region, a growing organisation with many great points of view and a great deal of information to be learned from them. This is a cover of the paper. I can send you, you'll see the presentation, so you'll be able to follow that link if you wish to read more. Okay. The key points I would like to cover tonight is what are intentional community living arrangements within the housing landscape, including co-housing, the social architecture of communal living, collaborative community design and management, and application to places for ageing, which is why that we're gathering. I welcome and we'll cover questions at the end. So if you notice down at the bottom of the screen, there's a number. That's the slide number. So if you just make a note of the slide number and your question, we can cover it later. And I'll provide, after this recording, I'll provide links to the published article and resources for places on ageing on LinkedIn.
Thank you. Okay.
So starting probably at the larger picture, the broader picture, what is communal living? Well, a key component is distinct from single family households. They do exist within the housing landscape and the framework in Australia and other countries in the world. It's quite common, yet whilst they're small numbers, they are quite commonly known of. During the PhD, I explored the breadth and probably the depth of communal living with under the expert guidance of my supervisors. In the beginning, it became apparent it was important to set about a typology to enable measurement and comparison between different regions. So I created a typology, then set about looking at the extent and demography of communal living in Australia, in the Australian context. And then I, through site visits, online questionnaire and interviews, compared the characteristics of Australian and European communities and found some interesting similarities and differences. And lastly, as I always believe it's important to make practical application, I made recommendations for the planning industry. Ryan, I just had a thought then. I feel I should check in. Is the connection being very clear? And are you able to hear? And I assume everybody else is able to hear.
No, the connection's great. The graphics look good, and we can hear you fine. It's as good as you can expect.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I mentioned on the previous slide, there's the typology or types of communal living. I created a way of, I felt that there was 3 types of communal living arrangements: institutional communal housing, shared housing, and intentional community living arrangements. Once identifying them, I set about ways to critique or compare them with a number of points. One was the approach of how that they were led, institution-led or resident-led. Were the arrangements formal or informal? Funding, did it come from an external provider or was it the residents themselves? The resident autonomy, did they have full autonomy or limited over their decisions? And the resident population, just a measure of potentially how large they were, and the motivation for why that they came to be. Now, in my thesis, I didn't explore in depth the first 2, but I expanded on the intentional community living arrangements. Okay.
And just for background, Jason, a number of us probably come from the architectural point of view, have approached, come from a background of aged care, or it's institutional aged care, put it that way. So design of institutional aged care. And one of the interesting things about this journey we've been on is that it's become apparent that the future, from our point of view, the future of aged care is less about institutions than it is about housing, sort of a form of housing, and perhaps a form.
Kyle, I think.
A co-housing format.
Okay.
I'll just deal with the background noise.
Thank you. And I'll see, oh, we've got a technical thing happening here. I don't understand what's going on there. I ran through this not minutes before.
I'll just try from current slides. Here you go there.
Yes, I will have to. There's something going on with the timing. Okay, so I introduced I looked at the research and assessed what were the definitions of intentional communities from a broad spectrum of authors. And from that, I felt there was an important need to add the distinction of living arrangements in addition to the, why are we looking at different ones? In addition to the existing definitions, I felt that living arrangements was a key point that needed to be expanded upon. Mm-hmm. So I set with the intention that ICLAs are a type of collaborative housing where a group of 5 or more unrelated people, that was common in the literature, choose to combine their skills, resources and efforts and to collectively build or rent and maintain homes and community structures, share social activities, offer neighbourly care for each other and use a system of inclusive governance. This is very much for the research setting the scope and also for future studies to help classify how communities would fit into that definition or not.
Yes, and that topic of unrelated people was really the key issue, because people live together all the time as families with 5 or more, but unrelated individuals was where things started to change, or
yes.
Had another layer to it.
Yes. Okay, so then from there, I started to look at, well, what were the characteristics? I'm going to try this again. No, it's...
Yep, there you go.
What were the characteristics of ICLAs? Well, I analysed the social, ecological and economic characteristics of them from site visits and visiting the Australian and European communities. And important point to note is that those 3 characteristic aspects are part of the GEN dimensions of regeneration. The GEN is in Global Eco Village Network dimensions of regeneration. From there, I have great appreciation for software that's available today, coded information that enabled a hierarchy of the characteristics. And from there, it became very apparent that the social things that were talked about, mentioned, written in documents, even in the setup of the communities that I visited, the social aspects were significantly more important and more talked about. And you can see there that they're nearly double they are double the other 2. So taking that a step forward, I looked at, particularly for this presentation, I looked at the social characteristics and delved a little deeper into the grouping them. And I found that, firstly, it's a good idea to explain this table. I looked at Australian and European communities and urban and rural differences. Primarily the rural communities were eco-villages and the urban ones ended up being co-housing often.
Right.
And I just did an analysis of how they compared against each other with these characteristics. And I found that, in my opinion, that the communication was extremely important, membership process was important, and how meetings were conducted and agreements and guidelines were conducted also. They were key, and what I term is this actually defines the social architecture of communities. I didn't highlight it, but I believe an important component of successful community living is some form of shared meals as well, because of that increasing the social interaction. And in amongst retirement villages as well as urban communes that I visited across the spectrum, it was the shared meals that was real important gathering point. So that was looking at the qualitative, what was the characteristics from a analysing the discussions. Then on a completely different wing, I with the support of my, or guidance of my supervisors, looked at the statistical analysis of communal living in Australia. And there I jumped into the Australian Bureau of Statistics census data. And to help me and also help readers, I felt it was important to categorise how the census was set up around the Australian population and how communal living fitted in that. So if we look across at the top there, we've got Australia's population, a whole bunch of BODs, and the majority of those, of that population, live in private dwellings. A smaller proportion live in non-private dwellings. And if we look at private dwellings, these are separated houses, flats, units, etc. Non-private dwellings is much more, much broader, and usually, in my opinion, is institutional communal housing, everything from prisons to hospitals to boarding houses. That was quite important to separate those two, and it is separated in, so following the census structure, I separated those two, and I introduced something that isn't in the census for this categorisation, the living arrangements, and termed these how that they fitted in with the dwellings, and below that was the households. So basically, people live in a household, they have a living arrangement, and that household could be a private dwelling or a non-private dwelling, and they're part of the Australian population. Of particular interest for this talk, and of course my thesis, was to talk about community living arrangements. This is the greyed area from below, with particular focus on the intentional community living arrangements. It's greyed out because the ICLAs are not recorded in any form in the census. It would be a great undertaking to make that happen, but they're not there. So we had to devise ways to measure them differently. So that was the census. This is the census, an analysis of census data. You'll notice at the top of category, we've categorised non-communal living arrangements, single family and lone person, and then communal living arrangements, all of the others. What was interesting from 2006 to 2011, the first analysis that I did, was finding that there was a decrease. But then when the 2016 data came out, saw that again there was a decrease in non-communal living arrangements. And of course, this meant a swing towards communal living arrangements. Now, 16.9% to 20% is a 46% swing. And if we look at that, that's almost 5 million people in Australia live communally in some form of communal living arrangement or another.
And Jason, that's specifically people who are not in institutional care.
No, if you see where there's other non-household institutional communal housing, yes, it includes people who are in institutions. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that was in the census. As I mentioned before, there was no data available specifically for co-housing, eco-villages or urban communes or things like that. So myself and colleagues came up with, well, I seeded the idea and we worked out a way to look at data. Well, firstly, a previous study done in 1987 had looked at using magazine subscription to people who regularly bought a magazine that lived in communities. We decided to choose a different path, and that was looking at it's very, very connected communities. So we looked at ICLA association websites and used an online questionnaire. And this was things like the Global Eco Village Network, Co-Housing Australia, the Fellowship for Intentional Community. In there, it was focused upon eco-villages and co-housing. From that, we're able to estimate a population of 22,000 members. So that's a very small component of the Australian population. However, they lived across, theorised they live across 1,700 communities. We had to do some projections from actual figures to what we perceived there would be, because a lot of communities actually didn't want to be known which is an interesting theme that I've seen around the world, that sometimes communities go under the radar for a whole lot of reasons.
Very interesting.
As I mentioned, it was last calculated by 1984 by Bill Metcalf and Frank Van Clay, and their figures and the location of where the population was, I'll show on the next page, were very, very similar findings. While it's a smaller proportion of the Australian population, these communities are often quite long-lived, and they do have sustainable modes of operation. I think that's a key point, that we can learn a lot from them. If we look at ICLAs across Australia, it took a bit of time to pull together this, to learn how to do this, for one thing, with the data, and secondly, to pull it together. This is showing the intentional community living arrangements dotted around Australia. The larger triangles means there's more per postcode. Of particular interest, like I see that they are around the major cities of Australia, with particular density, northern New South Wales and southeast Queensland. And we theorised that this is because that during the 1970s and 1980s, there was cheap available agricultural land that became available for sale. And a lot of those communities still exist today. However, we don't have any large tracts of land in Australia that are available specifically for eco-villages or co-housing. So the population over the two time periods, 1984 to 2017, similar population. I believe, however, that's going to change because of the trend that we saw in the ABS census data. Now, if we drill down a little bit, this is a high level picture, this one. If we look at co-housing across Australia, in the southern states of Australia, we do have co-housing communities already existing, being designed, implemented. To my knowledge, there's none in Darwin, and I've yet to see one in Queensland. However, I know that there's lots being talked about. But probably the closest that I've seen is the eco-village in Maleny, which is based loosely upon a co-housing situation. I'd be really happy to be challenged on that point, that we don't have any, because I'd like to learn of ones that do exist. Okay, now I know that this group has probably touched upon co-housing, particularly the last speaker, Kirsty, going through the design elements.
Jason, when you use the word co-housing, you mean something quite specific, don't you? And as it applies to, when you're asking the question, are there any in Brisbane, you mean something quite specific.
Yes, yes. Yeah, so on the next two slides, I'll go into detail. Great question, Ryan. So co-housing, smaller private dwellings clustered around communal facilities. Has anyone seen this picture before? It's becoming quite well known. This is Earth Song in New Zealand, a very well designed community, and it's seeming like they're doing great things and spreading the word. A key feature of co-housing is often, but not always, communal meals, at least 1 to 3 times per week. And they're designed to maximise communal interaction. A key point is that they're resident designed and developed. So if we look at the terminology for co-housing, which was introduced by 2 architects in the United States who brought the idea from Denmark to Australia. It has 6 defining characteristics. One is it's a participatory process. The next, the designs that facilitate community interaction, has extensive common facilities and fully self-contained dwellings. So people have that choice to interact, or that they can be living separately in their self-contained home. And they have complete resident management, decision-making, financial decisions, and even management of the grounds or the buildings and things like that. They have non-hierarchical structures and separate income sources. And those components can be applied to a whole lot of architectural designs. But to me, a key point is that those concepts go across the design, how the design came to be and the build came to be. Of those two, I believe there's two that are extremely important, is the participatory process and the complete resident management. And I believe these are important because what I have seen of other types of development, often those two are either a tick box or a minimal involvement. Yet I believe for successful, sustainable communities over the long term, that those two need to be completely be made aware of and invested time and money into. So we talked about communities, the types of them, narrowed down to intentional communities, and then co-housing. Now let's go a step further, which is elder co-housing, which is a growing phenomenon around the world. And I offer to any of you to do a Google on elder co-housing or co-housing for elder generation, and you'll get a swath of both academic literature, such as these, talking about the benefits and the challenges too, of course, but the benefits of providing space where elders provide their own space, actually, to age together. Mutual support, reducing public expenditure, and then there's looking at specifics of women, the gender ratio. Academically, I've not delved into in depth the elder co-housing. I was primarily focused upon intentional community living arrangements. However, I can see a growing need for greater research and greater practical projects on the ground with elder co-housing in Australia. Yeah. The Europeans and the North Americans particularly are doing very well in this, and Australia, we need to lift the game, and there's a lot to learn from. It's also appearing in the mainstream media. This group, the Baba Yaga group, is a women's co-housing in Paris, and they're all elders, and they started it and did it themselves. Right. And to me, led the charge. It comes up in the conversation. Cohabitation to co-housing. Older baby boomers create living arrangements to suit new needs. It's an exciting topic area. And here on the Sunshine Coast, recently, or not so recently, 5 years ago, group that's formed their own mini co-housing community. However, actually, now that I know it, this group is one owner and people rent from that owner. So it's a quasi co-housing community. Co-housing primarily is everyone is on an equal footing. It's part of the holistic design.
Right. Yep.
So we just talked about elder co-housing. What can this mean for places for aging? All this potential knowledge that we can draw from to help with meeting the demand and meeting it better than we currently are for places for aging. I believe it needs a focus and investment in developing the social architecture of the community interaction well in advance of the design of the built environment. I feel that's very important. And okay. I don't believe that there's any hard, fast statements to say yes or no, but I believe in the majority of developments would be doing any community interaction or social architecture after the built environment, and I think it needs to be the reverse.
So that tends to imply that you need to have a community, a group to engage with first, and I guess in our experience, you build facilities and then fill them. But this is an idea around building from the ground up. So identifying the need, defining a group that want to be part of that solution, and then talking to them about it.
Yes. So great point, Ryan. And I've got a couple of slides that speak to that because I feel that's important. and you do too, clearly. The second point, I believe that community members need to be given the facility to outline their desired community needs, and then the designers create. So it's building upon that first statement.
Right.
And it requires a collaborative approach. And I've read a bit about collaborative approaches, and I theorised something in a recommendation in my thesis about how the community development currently, in my opinion, happens. There's the grassroots bottom-up development of community, and then there's the developer-led top-down. So if we look at bottom-up first, and we look, there's a level of influence in community design and operation. And you can see that in the stakeholder spectrum, that community residents have a lot of say, a lot of involvement in the development of the community. And going up through the spectrum, developers have much less. So a typical rural eco-village would have very little involvement with the developers or government, and want to do it themselves because it's grassroots. Mm. By the way, this is quite idealistic. It's a spectrum, so there's no from one, either or. It's a spectrum in between. I'm just theorising this. The second is the developer-led top-down development of community. I suggest that the reverse of it, that developers and building industry professionals, such as architects like yourself, Ryan, have a lot of influence over the community design and how it operates. And unfortunately, I'm probably open to criticism on this, that community residents actually have the least amount of influence on the design and operation.
Absolutely, yeah. But I guess we're very mindful of that and try and anticipate their needs. Yep. But it's clearly they are not in the room directing the pen.
Yes. So one thing I learnt about intentional communities was, rather than a hierarchical organisational structure and hierarchical meetings, and that a lot of things are done in circles, and therefore that there's a equalitarian, equal say. Takes a lot of time, but there's more equal say amongst residents for decisions. So I theorised, why not, instead of top down, bottom up, lay this on the side, so that there's a collaborative zone of influence, so that there's no one having very little say. And of the stakeholder spectrum, developers and community residents work together to influence the design and operation of the community. And again, this is something I believe would take investment to learn how to do this. And then secondly, once we know, then actually implement this as an ongoing regular process as part of co-housing design. I'd like to highlight, this is in my recommendations in the thesis, and to date I've submitted my thesis, as my two supervisors who are attending tonight could attest to, and awaiting for the examination to go through. I'm imagining I'll have critique on, but I've felt it important to share some of the ideas.
Yeah, I feel like you'll have to expand a bit on what that bow tie zone sort of really means in practice.
Yes, yeah. Although I won't delve into that tonight. No. But a summary would be that at the beginning, actually, I do talk about it a little bit in the next couple of slides as a particular example on how to go through that. So when I was working with Malcolm in EDQ, we had a talk about, there was a block of land that EDQ had, and I said, what about co-housing? How would we go about that? And I said, well, this is how I think we could. Pre-select 8 to 12 future residents from newspaper advertisement or from hosting a community meeting.
Yeah, okay, so they sign up. Yeah, it's a volunteer.
They volunteer, and they have some introduction into what's involved, because it would be a time involvement for them. They'd basically be sitting alongside designers for a couple of months. Maybe not every day, of course, but they would have a relationship for some time. So they'd need to have interest in it. And a key point is that they're actually really wanting to live collectively. And my opinion is they're actually becoming more and more easy to find people who are wanting to do this. Conduct a 2 to 3 day training on the steps of how to go through co-housing from go to woe. Catherine McCammett and Charles Durrett in the United States, who are the architects who first coined this term, they've developed a 2 day program on how to do it. Doesn't mean it's actually designed, but it's understanding the steps. From that, to support these residents over the development period. So they're actually going to be part and parcel of the development as champions for the project. And I perceive that there's some way that they'd need to be compensated for their time or reduction in their future living costs or something along those lines. Co-housing founders, which co-housing can take up to 7 to 10 years to develop, are often exhausted financially and emotionally by the time that the development is built. I believe by supporting them to be involved that we can actually shorten the development period. I perceive this might be quite radical, but it may not be too. And another key component is providing aftercare once the place has been developed, to support resident interaction after the move-in for a minimum of 2 years, to help them through conflict resolution, improving their decision-making. These people are potentially going to be living collectively for years. Our modern society has taught us to be separated. So this is a relearning of how we function together on a reasonably close space too. So I believe it needs support afterwards. And then I believe there's a larger picture, and maybe this is a pipe dream, or maybe it is possible, that we can look at existing failing corporate-owned retirement villages, of which they are starting to pop up of having financial challenges and also service challenges, to help transition them into resident ownership, which is basically co-housing. I put that one in red because I think it might be contentious, but it's an idea that I feel is important, worth discussing. Taking this another step, I believe there's multiple ways of doing the larger scale. Would really appreciate sitting with a group of people to work through that. And here's some ideas on how to do it on a smaller scale. In Brisbane, I think you're from Brisbane, and there's a few people from Brisbane or the area, this region. In Brisbane, Coorparoo, Clayfield and Indooroopilly, we've got a number of 6, 10 and 12 pack medium density apartment buildings. They're usually under a strata title or something like that. I believe that they could be transferred. So this is an example to co-housing. So this is one I found on realestate.com, unit complex, 6 units there. I believe with changing from strata title to a collective title, community trust or a corporate title, this could be collectivized and convert 2 of the downstairs garages into a co-housing kitchen and a media room or a shared space. It wouldn't be very much different to the existing streetscape, and it could be done very subtly and very quickly. The garden out the front could be a community garden or a kids' play area. A key component of that proposal is get the cars out of there, get on the bus and get on the bike or the Uber or whatever, but those 2 or 3 car spaces can actually open up communal areas. Something I didn't highlight previously, and it's probably really important to now, is co-housing is smaller, self-contained homes, therefore enabling larger community facilities, which is accessible by all community members.
So that's the trade-off.
Yes, yeah. And there's many ways to reduce that so that you can then gain in the communal facilities. So that's one example. I believe there's also another. I looked at this one years ago, 2008. I used to live, this is in Maruka, I used to live. Can you all see my
Yes,
pointer?
yes, I can see your
I
cursor.
used to live in that house and had lots of trees. I loved it and had a great garden there. Next door was a lady who had lived there for 30 years. Her husband died, didn't want to leave home because the doctor was around the corner. The bus was just up there. She knew people in the street and she knew her home. But she was aging and she was alone and very scared, actually. And that got me thinking, why not have a group of houses, in this case 12 houses, typical suburban blocks, buy them collectively and raise one or all of them. It's quite common in Brisbane now to be lifting these dwellings and building extra rooms underneath or even whole dwellings.
Mm-hmm.
So to increase the density, get rid of all the back fences and turn one of the houses into a community facility with a community kitchen or games room or shared library or things like that. Could be done a lot smaller scale or larger scale, even down to 4 properties. Efficiencies of scale when it's done larger, of course. In doing that, it doubled the density. I did a financial calculation and I perceived it's about half the cost of knocking down all the houses and building a whole new structure there. It maintains the streetscape, and in the case of my neighbour, she could live in her same house, but just have neighbours downstairs or in half of her house to separated, as an example. And this is in every Australian city and probably United States in a different way in the European countries as well. I'm sure this isn't a unique idea, but I believe it needs more focus to see what can we do with what we've already got, particularly our streetscape and maintaining connection with the existing community.
So a lot of those ideas, Joseph, were part of the the Missing Middle initiative that
Yes.
Department of Housing and Public Works put out a little while ago. And so there was a lot of ideas, and I don't know how many of them proposed to become co-living. I don't know how they had lots of ideas about how to infill and to get better density, but co-living or community living wasn't necessarily a highlight of that work.
Yes. And Ryan, thank you for making it very poignant. My point before, design is often focused on the built environment. And here is a perfect example of, to do this, we would need to have to look at the social makeup of all of the people that live there, or at least some of them, and to give effort, time, and invest in those people and give them a voice to designing how they want to live, both in the built environment, but also how they want to interact. And that's where I feel that co-housing, modern co-housing, can have this as part of the suite of offerings. And now with a closing summary, again, Australia, 20%, 5 million people live communally in some form or another, and it's increasing. With the key additional point is that is in primarily houses that are designed for communal living. So we're seeing population trying to squeeze into our traditional homes and make modifications, be it with council permission or not. I believe we can learn a lot from ICLAs on how to support not just our community, but in particular our elders living communally, with an ability to help them age in place. Elder co-housing is proven around the world, and we're starting to see a bit of momentum and interest here in Australia, and perhaps it's already underway and I've not been aware of that. But I believe there's time to increase, now is the time to increase the application of co-housing in Australia. I believe that development needs to prioritise social architecture alongside the built environment. And just as a point I didn't mention before, the World Economic Forum and the United Nations are focusing upon this exact topic right now. Globally, how can we do this? And again, through the Global Eco Village Network, there's not directives, but there's energy and motion coming through. How can we do this with eco-villages and co-housing? I believe there's an opportunity to partner with the Global Eco-Village Network and Co-Housing Australia. And lastly, and this is probably a bit of a personal interest, I believe there's a need for collaborative community design and management that allows residents to age in place and have autonomy over how they live. Well, that's the end of my presentation. I'm open to questions, and just to let you know, I'm now at the stage of finishing my PhD, or very, very close to it, and wanting to say, oh, what's next? And opening to how I can be involved, support co-housing development in Australia, and also eco-village development in Australia. There's my LinkedIn details. And as I mentioned before, Ryan, I'll after the recording, I'll add additional links to anything that I've shared tonight on the page. Yeah. So thank you for hearing, and I'm open to your questions and feedback.
Thank you, Jason. That's great. Perhaps I could come back to an earlier point in relation to your presentation. I'd probably like to hear from you a little more about the social architecture. And you talked about a process of mapping out a number of volunteers early on and training them, and then following up over the next 2 years. Could you give us a little bit more detail there?
Sure. What I theorised was to once having a conceptual project in just very concept form, a region that we are looking at, and then to advertise through a community meeting and say, this is a potential, who's interested? My opinion would be that you'd have to select out of hundreds of people, because the interest I'm getting, or people contacting me wanting to live communally. So that's not answering your question, sorry. So once finding people who are interested, pre-select them with their ability to be involved over a couple of year period.
Yeah.
And then in the beginning part, to have a quite a concentrated workshop looking at what is co-housing, what is the governance structure, so how do we make decisions, or how could we make decisions, the regularity of meetings, what's involved in living communally, so that this is a mixture of quite pragmatic, direct statements of this is how other communities do it, to throughout that process, and also to enable the more softer social interaction. So actually having collective workshop that is experiential. Who are you? Do you want to live in a rural area? Do you want to live in a city area? Dogs, cats, yes or no? Drugs, these are the common things that come up. Drugs.
Oh, wow, yeah, okay.
Cats. What happens after relationships break up? And children for noise. Another key one is vegetarian, vegan, or meat eaters,
Right.
dope smokers. There's a lot of these things to cover, and a group that just meets for the first time, it's often very difficult.
It's like marriage counselling. Before
you're on the mark. Yeah.
Okay, and I mean, sort of on that, what are the skills that the group need to develop?
Well, firstly, with the help of a couple of facilitators, the ability to communicate respectfully.
Right.
And we perceive that we do that in business. I've worked in the corporate world, and I stand back and go, you know what? We know how to respectfully communicate, business-like, but to respect for, hey, when I said that to you yesterday, I wasn't really present, and I'm sorry, and I didn't mean for that to upset. Or is there something that you could share with me how that felt for you? That's just an example of a much deeper level of communication that takes not hours, possibly not even weeks and months, but years. It's impossible to create that in short term. But what is possible is to create awareness of the tool. Sociocracy, non-violent communication. These are all themes that are happening throughout eco-villages.
Right.
So a languaging, and then the practicals. Okay, to live in co-housing, we're going to share something. And that might be a communal space where we have meals 3 times a week. How are we going to do that? It's not so much do you cook, do I cook, but it's do we want to have 3 meals a week? I went to communities that had 1 meal a month and others that had 3 meals a week. So again, just to highlight, those 2 to 3 days to me are to outline this is what it could look like. Towards the end of that, say, who's still committed? And by the way, let's now go into a more in-depth process over months that might only be a couple of hours at a time to develop what's our governance structure. Are we going to use sociocracy or consensus? Or it's almost like, I'm not sure what all your professions are, but I see in the architecture and planning and financial, there's a lot of skill set that you have been trained. Living communally, we don't really have it anymore. Fortunate to live in a large family, you would, but in a community setting, we've got fences and we've got the council that we can ring up if we don't want to talk to the neighbour.
Yeah. Jason,
yes.
Sorry, I get okay, I'm an analog girl and I come from a long line of suburban living with those fences that you were talking about.
Yeah.
I'm interested to know what is the motivation that takes people to look at the communal living. I grew up in an era of hippie communes, right? So I didn't go there, but I knew about them. So there's this ideological share amongst your needs and do all of that probably still is there. And then there's the practical application, particularly as people age, where they've lost their partner, they can't look after their house, a bit like your neighbour, but they want to live in the same place. But I don't necessarily want you to lift my house and put people underneath, but I want to share my backyard and my neighbour's time. So going even to that idea where you were seeking nominations, there's a core motivation is, peace, brother, I want to all live together hey, I've got some practical things here. I'm isolated, I'm lonely, I need to share the financial, I've got financial resources that I need to share. So it's a long continuum of different motivations. So, I can't reconcile that. Sure.
So Sandra, great point, and it's good that you're bringing your own experience to it. My experience of being within groups is that there's very rarely ever 2 people exactly the same on most things. So this was shown to me, I'm grateful that somebody showed me this process, and that I will often facilitate with, is invite people to come together, stand in a group, and then to ask the question, here's a line from suburban to rural. Where do you sit on that line? And then people get to look at each other and have a bit of a talk, and they form that in their mind, but also look at, there's a spectrum here. And then I invite them a bit more risque, say, how close do you want to live to each other? Do you want to be able to hear the next door neighbour, or do you want a yard away? That process take not a couple of hours, but an hour or so to help people then come back from that and then form groups from that who are clustered around similarity. That's answering part of your question. The other part I perceived is, I've forgotten now. You're talking about the spectrum. What was the other part, please, Sam?
I guess I like that idea of the people sort of find their own milieu, through those questions. But what takes them there in the first place?
Yes, very, very, very good question. I asked this question in the questionnaire and also in my interviews, and I was expecting save money. I thought that's going to be the one that ticks the box. Primarily, people were coming together for the more softer social things, like young family wanting to share parenting with others. They wanted to have an elder nearby that their kids had interaction with an older person. So that was a key component. Another was loneliness. People wanted to prevent against loneliness. I got quite surprised and a little down about how much loneliness is around the world, in the Western world. So loneliness was a key thing that people were wanting to find an alternative to.
Just for those that are interested, loneliness is one of the big factors for dementia. Just
Wow. Wow. That's interesting. And the third was this sense of, well, if I don't need a car, can I share it with a neighbour? Or actually, there's 4 houses, we only need one lawnmower. Let's just save $600 per house. And over time, we could all have solar panels, and we don't have an electricity bill across 5 houses. It starts to become an economic, an ecological, and a social. That's why the focus of my thesis was those 3 areas. Religion also featured quite high. And I actually only went to one religious community, but I've found that is a big draw card for a lot of people wanting to live with people of similar religion. Yeah. Thanks for your question, Sandra.
Jason,
yes,
sorry, I was looking for a natural break in the conversation, so I might stop the recording there.
Yeah.
And by all means, let's keep chatting, but we might leave the audience at that point.